Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Throughout history, whispers of forbidden sex, nameless, rootless, and long vanished, have drifted just beyond the reach of accepted memory. These are not the cults of pop culture or conspiracy theory, but something older, more abstract, and far less comprehensible. They are the supposed worshippers of beings whose names fracture language, whose forms unravel perception, whose presence was never meant to be perceived. Elder gods, whose awakening was sought by a handful of forgotten adherents, and whose traces were subsequently consumed by time, silence, or something far worse. The purpose of this documentary is not to dramatize, but to investigate. We examine the literary and philosophical foundation upon which these fictional cults were constructed, tracing their roots from ancient heresies and mystery religions to their modern reappearances in horror fiction. We explore the way such cults operate as symbolic expressions of metaphysical terror, embodying a fear not of evil, but of irrelevance, entropy, and epistemic collapse. This is a journey through obscure texts, suppressed ideas, and unsettling patterns that stretch across myth, anthropology, and literature. Our approach will be methodical, interdisciplinary, and disquieting. Through historical context, narrative dissection, and cultural analysis, we will seek not to explain these forgotten cults, but to understand why they are so effective at haunting the modern imagination. By watching, by listening, you are already part of the investigation. And as we proceed, it may become increasingly unclear whether these cults were ever invented or merely remembered. Before we can speak meaningfully of vanished cults that sought to awaken the elder gods, we must consider the peculiar historical lens through which they were first imagined. The early 20th century, particularly the decades between 1900 and 1940, was marked by a growing disillusionment with human exceptionalism. Amid rapid technological advancement, the lingering spiritual trauma of the First World War, and a dawning awareness of deep time through geology and anthropology, authors like H.P. Lovecraft and his literary successors developed a body of fiction that responded not with hope or transcendence, but with cosmic resignation. In this context, the idea of obscure cults operating in the margins of known history emerged not as fantastical entertainment, but as a logical extension of an increasingly fragmented worldview. These cults were never simply metaphors for evil. Rather, they became narrative tools for articulating the horror of a universe fundamentally indifferent to human existence. Consider carefully, this literary impulse did not arise in a vacuum. Lovecraft, for instance, was well versed in the anthropological texts of his time, including the controversial theories of James Frazer and Margaret Murray. Both proposed that ancient belief systems persisted beneath the surface of modern religion, encoded in folk rituals, superstitions, and rural traditions. The idea that remnants of pre-Christian, pre-rational worship could endure in forgotten corners, only to erupt in moments of irrational violence or ecstatic revelation, was both academically tantalizing and existentially horrifying. In fiction, these ideas were reshaped into the concept of cults who preserved antediluvian knowledge, often at the cost of their own humanity. Their vanishing was not an erasure, but a hiding, an ominous silence rather than a defeat. Such cults are not depicted as unified religious movements, but as fragmented echoes of something more ancient than history. Their presence in fiction is often signaled through suggestion rather than exposition. A coastal town where no outsiders are welcome, a remote village with curiously inbred customs, or a manuscript that references rituals long outlawed. These narrative decisions are not merely aesthetic, they mirror the archaeological uncertainties of the era. In the early 20th century, discoveries of forgotten cities and untranslated scripts, such as the Indus Valley seals or the undeciphered Rongorongo glyphs of Easter Island, contributed to a cultural atmosphere ripe for speculation. What if human civilization was not the first? What if our histories are only the most recent layers atop deeper buried strata? The cult, in this model, becomes not just a religious faction, but a surviving thread of something unspeakably old. We must recognize that the strategy of vanishing is itself a literary device. To depict a functioning, open cult is to invite rational explanation, but to imply that a cult once existed, that it acted upon the world and then disappeared without a trace, is to introduce epistemological doubt. Where did they go? Were they destroyed, or did they succeed? In this ambiguity lies the true horror. It is not simply that these fictional sects worship monstrous deities, but that they might have touched something real and unrepeatable. Their disappearance becomes proof of contact, not failure. This logic reverses the typical religious narrative. Martyrdom is not a testament to divine silence, but to divine response. And in cosmic horror, divine response is never salvation. It is annihilation, or worse, transformation. The creators of these stories, Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and others, were not merely inventing monsters. They were reconstructing a kind of mythic ethnography. Their invented cults often mimic the structural patterns of real-world secret societies and mystery religions: strict hierarchies, ritualized language, sacred geographies, and a division between initiates and profane outsiders. Yet these structures are always tinged with decay, suggesting that what survives of the cult is only a remnant, a degraded version of a once potent gnosis. In this, we find a recurring motif: the fragment. Cults are never shown whole, only glimpsed in broken ritual artifacts, incomplete texts, or the garbled memories of mad survivors. This is not just a narrative flourish. It reflects the literary modernist fascination with incompletion, and perhaps more importantly, it reflects the way historical knowledge itself operates, through gaps, erasures, and partial reconstructions. It is not simply the horror of belief that animates these narratives, but the horror of contextual belief, that a system once made complete sense to its adherents, and that such sense has now been lost. To read about these cults is to look at a puzzle missing most of its pieces, knowing that what it once depicted was profoundly unsettling. The creators of these myths played deliberately with this tension. By scattering references to the same cult across different stories, authors constructed a sense of narrative continuity that readers could only partially grasp. The infamous esoteric order of Dagon, the cults of Yuggoth, the star worshippers of Leng, all are mentioned as if self-evident, their true beliefs never fully revealed. This literary technique simulates the experience of encountering suppressed or partially erased history. The reader becomes the scholar, the archaeologist, the anthropologist, and therefore the accomplice. What emerges from this strategy is not a depiction of belief, but of rupture. The cult exists where historical record ends. It thrives in margins, in footnotes, in contradictions. and it vanishes not because it failed, but because history itself is incapable of containing it. This reveals something profound. The most terrifying implication of these vanished sects is not their existence, but the possibility that they operated successfully and that our current world is the result. With this possibility in mind, we turn next to the deeper roots of such narratives. Before these literary cults were named, their shadows already existed in ancient rites, ecstatic religions, and pre-modern cosmologies. To understand how such forgotten worship became imaginable, we must now trace their cultural and philosophical antecedents. To grasp the enduring power of forgotten cults in the cosmic horror tradition, we must reach far beyond modern fiction into the deeper bedrock of human thought. Long before such sects were framed in the pages of Lovecraftian fiction, cultures across the ancient world imagined hidden worship, buried gods, and forbidden rites. These mythic templates did not simply inform the aesthetics of the horror genre. They provided a conceptual framework for understanding the terrifying idea that belief can precede knowledge, and that the sacred might also be the unrecognizable. The vanished cult, in this light, is not a novelty of literary invention, but a shadow that recurs in religious history, resurfacing wherever orthodoxy fails to explain the strange, the ecstatic, or the abyssal. In classical antiquity, we encounter numerous examples of cultic traditions that existed in tension with the dominant religious structures. The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, the cult of Dionysus, and the Mithraic rites of the Roman legions all operated within a paradox of secrecy and influence. They promise sacred knowledge only to initiates, often swearing them to silence under penalty of death. Their rituals involve dismemberment myths, symbolic rebirth, subterranean chambers, and the manipulation of time through cyclical cosmology. It is not difficult to see how these features map onto later fictional portrayals of cults who worship beings beyond comprehension. The secrecy, isolation, and sacred trauma at the heart of these real-world traditions offer an uncanny echo of the invented orders that haunt cosmic horror texts. They were not simply alternative religions. They were other kinds of knowing, alien in method and inaccessible to outsiders. Consider the Gnostic sects of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Their worldview proposed that the visible world was a mistake, a flawed simulation created by a lesser, ignorant deity. Salvation, for the Gnostic, lay in uncovering hidden truths about the divine pleroma beyond material reality. Some Gnostic texts even described secret names and rituals to awaken cosmic beings, beings who had been forgotten by the mainstream churches. This is not merely an esoteric tangent. It establishes a clear philosophical lineage. The notion that reality is false, that truth is hidden and must be reclaimed through personal awakening, and that this awakening can be catalyzed by texts, dreams, or rituals. These are precisely the elements that define the fictional cults of the elder gods. It is not simply that ancient sects influenced horror writers. It is that the epistemic anxiety of these ancient sects reappears in modern literature as horror rather than hope. We must pause here to note a crucial transformation. In traditional religious frameworks, hidden knowledge often promises liberation. In cosmic horror, it promises collapse. This reversal is not incidental. It reflects a profound shift in modern metaphysical anxiety. Where the ancients feared ignorance, the modern horrorist fears understanding too much. Cults in this tradition do not seek communion with the divine to be saved. They seek to breach the veil of reality, knowing full well that what lies beyond may be monstrous. The philosophical movement known as pessimistic existentialism, most notably represented by Schopenhauer and later Curran, emphasized the unbearable nature of existence and the seductive allure of annihilation. One could argue that the cults of cosmic horror are dramatizations of this desire, not to live meaningfully, but to cease meaning altogether, to return the universe to its original state of unknowing. The ancient world offers further examples of traditions that flirted with obliteration. Some Vedic hymns describe gods who sleep between aeons, who breathe out the world and will eventually inhale it again. In certain strands of pre-Buddhist Tibetan-born religion, deities were not protectors, but dangerous forces to be appeased with masks, mirrors, and secret chants, rituals not unlike those described in fictional grimoires. The Mesoamerican worldview, particularly among the Aztecs, posited that the gods required blood and suffering to sustain cosmic order, and that cyclical destruction was inevitable. These systems did not flatter the human ego. They placed mankind within a recurring pattern of sacrifice and dissolution, where the divine was as likely to consume as to bless. When filtered through the lens of 20th century literature, these themes, sacrifice, recursion, unknowable gods, take on new life as metaphors for psychological entropy and the limits of rational comprehension. In medieval Europe, we find yet another precursor, the persistent paranoia surrounding heresies and secret sects. The Cathars, condemned by the Church in the 13th century, were accused of dualist cosmology, rejecting the material world as the work of an evil god. Their supposed rituals, though likely exaggerated by inquisitors, were described as inverted, secretive, and blasphemous. The Knights Templar, following their suppression in 1312, were similarly enveloped in legends of heretical worship and arcane initiation. What matters here is not the historical accuracy of these accusations, but their narrative structure. The idea of a hidden group operating in opposition to visible order, maintaining dangerous knowledge, and eventually being disappeared by dominant forces. This template becomes a recurring mechanism in cosmic horror. The cult is not just hidden, it is erased from official memory, as though the act of remembering itself threatens the social fabric. Consider carefully what unites these diverse traditions, from Eleusinian processions to Gnostic invocations to Aztec blood offerings, is not merely their theological content, but their epistemic posture. They all begin from the premise that accepted knowledge is incomplete, that truth is fragmented, hidden, and accessible only through specific, often dangerous means. The fictional cults of the older gods adopt this same posture. They reject consensus reality, embracing instead a vision of the universe where the sacred is monstrous, the hidden is corrosive, and the pursuit of truth is indistinguishable from madness. Their resemblance to real traditions is not accidental. It is structural, thematic, and profoundly unsettling. They echo ancient beliefs, not to parody them, but to remind us that the terror of knowing too much has always haunted human consciousness. The power of a forgotten cult does not reside solely in its practices or theology, but in the symbols and syllables it leaves behind. In both historical and fictional contexts, language operates as the final residue of vanished belief. When texts fail, and when rituals cease to be enacted, it is often a name, a sign, or a phoneme that endures, inscribed on a stone tablet, etched in marginalia, or whispered without context in remote oral traditions. In the world of cosmic horror, this symbolic residue is not a clue to be deciphered, but a contagion to be avoided. The cult's language, its chants, invocations, and signs, carries not clarity but corruption. It does not reveal the divine, it dissolves the self. This thematic tension between language as revelation and language as annihilation lies at the heart of the elder cult's mythic appeal. From an etymological perspective, the invented names of cosmic entities and their associated cults are crafted to evoke strangeness, antiquity, and a sense of the pre-human. Consider names like Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, or Shub-Niggurath, constructed with glottal stops, uncommon phoneme clusters, and a deliberate ambiguity between consonant and vowel emphasis. These names do not belong to any known linguistic family, yet they often suggest one. Lovecraft himself claimed that Cthulhu approximated a human attempt to vocalize something fundamentally alien. This construction technique simulates the experience of encountering a word from a language no longer spoken, an echo of meaning with no referent. It is not merely unreadable, it is unpronounceable, which in this context becomes a marker of metaphysical danger. The idea that a name cannot be spoken without invoking the thing it names reflects a deep-seated cultural anxiety around performative language. Speech acts that do not describe reality, but alter it. We must recognize that this linguistic strategy echoes real-world esoteric traditions in which the true name of a deity is hidden, forbidden, or accessible only to initiates. In Kabbalistic thought, for instance, the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, is both central and veiled, unspeakable by the unworthy. In ancient Egyptian religion, knowing the secret name of a god could grant power over them. These traditions feed directly into the horror of names that deform perception or summon impossible geometries. Fictional grimoires, like the Necronomicon or the Pnakotic manuscripts, describe symbols that cannot be fully seen, letters that shift under observation, and languages that implant meanings in the mind without translation. These texts do not behave as normal books do. They are agents of transformation. To read them is to become unmoored from consensual reality. It is not merely knowledge that is transmitted, but something far more invasive. A striking motif within these fictional cults is the recursive nature of their symbols. Sigils appear across geographies, etched into disparate ruins with no cultural contact. Chants echo across centuries, preserved in dream or trance. This circular repetition is key. It implies not only that the cults share a common origin, but that the language itself may be viral, independent of culture or time. One finds the same spiral carved into a megalith in Brittany and scratched into a cellar door in rural Vermont. One hears the same rhythm in a lullaby, sung in a Pacific fishing village, and in the mutterings of a delirious academic. This synchronicity is not presented as evidence of conspiracy, but of something far more disquieting, a truth that cannot help but resurface, a symbolic system that is remembered by the world itself, or implanted in human memory, like a dream that precedes history. The symbols of these cults frequently resist semantic content. They do not spell out doctrine or ethical instruction. Rather, they function like mandalas, labyrinths, or occult glyphs, designed not to convey meaning, but to induce altered states. The cultist does not understand the symbol in a discursive sense. They become it. Their trance, their worship, their transformation is mediated through symbols that bypass rational cognition. In this respect, The symbolic language of the elder cults aligns more closely with the neurological effects of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, than with traditional scripture. It overwhelms syntax and instead activates emotional or psychic states. In fiction, this is often portrayed as dangerous. The reader of the forbidden script goes mad, or worse, is opened to some outside force. Here, language becomes a membrane, a permeable boundary between realities. It is not a window, it is a door. What makes this especially disturbing is the way these languages are portrayed as contagious. To see the sign is to dream of it. To hear the chant is to repeat it. We encounter a narrative logic of mimetic infection. The symbol does not inform, it spreads. This is not metaphorical. Within the text, characters often find themselves compulsively sketching the same pattern, muttering alien words, or rearranging reality to match the structure implied by the symbol. The cult, in these instances, does not recruit members. It is the language itself that recruits, and once embedded, it cannot be removed. The implications here are deeply philosophical. If language shapes perception, then a corrupted language reshapes reality. It is not simply a matter of madness, but of epistemic collapse. The cultist does not go insane. They enter a new coherence, one that is incompatible with human civilization. We must ask, what does it mean to encounter a language we cannot forget, yet cannot understand? The horror lies not in being excluded from meaning, but in being included against our will. The viewer, the reader, the listener becomes participant simply by exposure. This implicates the audience directly and deliberately. The viewer of this documentary has already seen symbols, already read names that should not be known. The fictional logic says, it is too late. You are now marked. This rhetorical device transforms passive observation into active contamination, making the cult's language a vector rather than a relic. To understand why the forgotten cults of cosmic horror continue to disturb, we must move beyond content to examine form. The horror does not arise solely from the descriptions of monstrous gods or secret rites, but from the way these cults are embedded into fictional narratives as if they were historical realities. Writers in the cosmic horror tradition employ a wide array of techniques to simulate documentary authenticity, creating the illusion that the reader is not consuming fiction, but uncovering fragments of a suppressed ethnographic record. This deliberate blending of fabrication and formal realism constitutes one of the most unsettling strategies in the genre. The cults are not just told, they are discovered, as if their reality preceded the story. The result is a disquieting blurring of the line between myth and memory, suggestion and source. One of the most common techniques is the use of in-universe academic framing. Diaries, translated manuscripts, expedition reports, anthropological field notes, and second-hand accounts. These artifacts serve to distance the author and imply an underlying factual layer. Lovecraft mastered this with the Necronomicon, treating it not as a dramatic object, but as a recurring scholarly reference. Its casual mention in footnotes or correspondence between characters gives it weight. By avoiding detailed exposition, the text gains power through implication. Readers are given just enough to suspect a larger, unseen network of lore. This is not exposition, it is simulation. When a cult is mentioned offhand in a scholarly paper or an appendix, the gesture mimics the rhythm of real research, where the most disturbing truths are often buried in secondary sources or unexplained citations. We must recognize that this technique also mirrors actual archival practice. In the real world, scholars often work from incomplete records, lost languages, or fragmented myths. The absence of clarity is not a flaw, it is the condition of historical investigation. Cosmic horror texts replicate this epistemic structure. The cults never arrive fully explained. Instead, they are inferred from ruins, artifacts, or inconsistent testimonies. The protagonist finds a stone idol, a half-burnt letter, or a dream journal. The cult is reconstructed from these clues, not revealed through dialogue or plot. This mode of narrative suggests that truth is a puzzle whose pieces have been scattered, and more disturbingly, that some pieces have been removed deliberately. The horror deepens not with the discovery of the cult, but with the realization that someone or something has worked very hard to ensure it was forgotten. In many of these stories, the geographical setting contributes to the sense of mythic plausibility. The cult is placed in a real, mappable location, a remote village in Massachusetts, an island off the Pacific coast, an archaeological dig in Inner Asia, but is described in terms that resist empirical certainty. The use of vague boundaries, somewhere beyond the Andes, or contradictory descriptions. The ruins seemed older than any known civilization, yet bore marks of modern toolwork, reinforces the idea that these places exist just beyond the reach of history. They are liminal zones, between mapped and unmapped, remembered and erased. This geographical vagueness is not carelessness. It is a formal device. It invites the reader to participate in the fiction by imagining how such places might still exist, hidden by remoteness, disinterest, or design. One of the most profound effects of this myth-building strategy is the illusion of cross-textual continuity. By referencing the same cult across different stories and authors, the mythos acquires the texture of folklore. The esoteric order of Dagon, for example, appears not only in Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, but is alluded to in other tales by different writers. These shared references, often contradictory, create a sense of multi-generational rumor. Rather than clarify the cult's doctrine, they deepen its mystery. This mimics the way real oral traditions evolve, distorted, adapted, reframed by time and transmission. The result is a narrative ecosystem where the cult is both everywhere and nowhere, persistent yet unknowable. It is not simply a character or institution within the story. It becomes a presence across stories, haunting the edges of the canon. The creation of material culture within these fictional worlds further enhances their authenticity. Statues, relics, carvings, ceremonial robes. These artifacts are described with forensic precision, yet always with just enough ambiguity to invite doubt. The idol might be a crude native totem or an ancient depiction of something non-human. The script might be decorative or a phonetic representation of a lost pre-human tongue. This oscillation between artifact and enigma reinforces the sense that the cult once existed, but that its meaning has decayed beyond recovery. The reader is placed in the role of the ethnographer, tasked with interpreting evidence that resists interpretation. In doing so, the narrative reproduces the very process by which real-world religions and mythologies are reconstructed through partial data, speculation, and emotional inference. What makes these strategies so effective is that they transform the absence of information into a source of dread. The more gaps, contradictions, and missing pages a narrative includes, the more plausible the cult becomes. This paradox, where ignorance simulates realism, flips the reader's expectations. Normally, we seek stories that explain. In cosmic horror, we come to trust stories that refuse explanation. This reveals something profound. In these fictions, incompleteness is credibility. The forgotten cult is disturbing precisely because it cannot be neatly resolved. Its erasure becomes part of its meaning. It did not fail. It did not die. It vanished, and in doing so, became proof of a world beyond the archive. At the heart of the forgotten cults that populate the literature of cosmic horror lies a constellation of philosophical themes that distinguish them from the conventional terrors of folklore or theology. These are not sects that worship demons in the hope of gaining power, nor are they misguided heretics chasing a twisted form of salvation. Rather, they are metaphysical anomalies, groups that have seen too much, or perhaps not enough, and who operate according to conceptual frameworks incompatible with human cognition. The core ideas they embody, cosmic insignificance, entropic dissolution, and the destabilizing permeability of dream and reality, reveal not a religion, but a rupture. These cults do not provide answers. They destabilize the very structure of questioning. To engage with them is to abandon the protective illusions of meaning, coherence, and continuity. Let us begin with the most foundational theme, insignificance. Unlike traditional religions, which often elevate humanity's role in a divine narrative, the cults of cosmic horror confront the terrifying possibility that we do not matter at all. Their rites, symbols, and chants are not designed to flatter the ego or promise transcendence. They are acknowledgments of smallness. In Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, we read, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity." This is not mere metaphor. The cults who worship beings like Cthulhu or Azathoth do so not because they believe they are special, but because they have glimpsed the vastness in which human life is a biochemical accident. The terror is not that the gods are hostile, it is that they are indifferent. Cults persist in this literature as a symbolic confrontation with that indifference, a dramatization of what it means to live in a universe without intrinsic meaning or direction. But insignificance is only the beginning. What these cults truly revere is entropy, not as a physical process, but as a metaphysical condition. The worship of elder gods is often depicted not as an attempt to maintain cosmic order, but to return the universe to its original, pre-ordered state. Consider the recurring motif of the sleeping god who dreams our reality into being. This figure appears in multiple variants, from Lovecraft's Azathoth, the mindless chaos at the center of all things, to more recent interpretations of a god whose waking would dissolve all structure. The cult in this framework is not resisting chaos, but inviting it. Their rituals are not designed to preserve the world, but to unwind it. This inversion of sacred intent is crucial. It is not a mistake. It is a recognition that beneath the surface of every star, every thought, every breath, there is the slow pull toward dissolution. These cults do not worship destruction as violence. They venerate it as truth. We must pause here to consider the psychological implications. Why would any group seek such knowledge, let alone pass it down in chants and rites? The answer may lie in a third, equally disturbing concept: the fluidity between dream and reality. In many cosmic horror texts, cults are portrayed as accessing truth, not through reason or scripture, but through dreams. visions that arrive unbidden, often shared across great distances and among unrelated individuals. The dream does not represent the divine. It is the divine. In The Shadow Out of Time, Lovecraft writes of a strange sense of transferred personality and a subtle, baffling memory of unbodied freedom. This description, half mystical, half dissociative, suggests that the cultist enters a state in which waking and dreaming are indistinguishable. What is most unsettling is that these dreams are not subjective. They contain consistent symbols, architectures, and entities. The implication is that dreams are not private, but permeable, a medium through which higher forces communicate, or worse, infiltrate. The result of this dream permeation is a breakdown of epistemological boundaries. What can be known? What can be trusted? Cults that worship beings beyond time often inherit a fractured temporality. They do not believe in linear cause and effect, but in recursive cycles, moments of overlap, or timeless recurrence. This distorts not only their rituals, but their very perception of history. A chant repeated in the present may be responding to a ritual in the future. A sacrifice today may awaken a being who was already half present in the past. This strange causality is not simply narrative play. It reflects a deep philosophical unease with time itself. The cultist is not deluded. They are unmoored. They occupy a position outside the comfort of clocks and calendars. In this, the cult becomes a metaphor for the human fear of time's instability, not its progression, but its collapse. We must also consider how these philosophical themes render the cults terrifying, not in what they do, but in what they represent. Their very existence undermines the structures of meaning we rely on: science, morality, identity, temporality. They are not evil. They are orthogonal to ethics. The beings they worship are not malicious. They are too vast for such descriptors. This reveals something profound. The true horror is not malevolence, but scale. To be noticed by a god is terrifying. To be ignored is worse. The cultist internalizes this and turns it into ritual. Their worship becomes a kind of surrender, not of faith, but of self. This is not devotion. It is ontological suicide. It is not simply that the cults embody these concepts. It is that they enact them. Through language, through ritual, through dreaming, they become microcosms of entropy, insignificance, and dream instability. Their presence in fiction forces readers to confront a kind of sacred nihilism, one in which the desire to know is not rewarded, but punished. And yet, the narratives persist. The stories are told, perhaps because there is something human in this inhuman logic. Need to press our minds against the edges of what can be known, even if it tears us open. The entities at the center of the forgotten cults in cosmic horror are not gods in any traditional sense. They are not divine beings who intervene in moral conflicts, nor are they anthropomorphic deities who mirror the psychology of their worshippers. Instead, they are ontological anomalies, beings whose very existence shatters the coherence of human perception. These entities are not characters within a myth. They are the gravitational centers around which meaning breaks down. Their unknowability is not a result of secrecy, but of structural incompatibility. To comprehend them is to lose the framework that allows comprehension itself. The cults who worship them do not seek understanding. They seek proximity, resonance, or absorption, outcomes that are more dissolution than communion. A taxonomy emerges in the literature, however reluctantly. Scholars of the mythos often differentiate between great old ones outer gods, and dreamland entities, though these categories blur and overlap. The great old ones, such as Cthulhu, Hastur, and Dagon, are often associated with Earth or nearby dimensions. They sleep, imprisoned or dormant, and their worshippers aim to awaken them. These are not messianic returns, but geological upheavals. Cthulhu's rising, for example, is described not as a return of the king, but as a reordering of natural law. The outer gods, by contrast, like Azathoth or Nyarlathotep, represent forces beyond space and time. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, dreams the universe into being. Should he ever awaken, all reality would cease, not in punishment, but simply in cessation. There is no vengeance in these entities. There is only process, scale, and indifference. Dreamland entities such as Hypnos, the Black Pharaoh, or the gods of Kadath complicate this schema further. They are accessible not through space, but through consciousness. Their cults often center around sleep, trance, or dissociative states. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter encounters beings who both control and inhabit dreams, sometimes shaping the waking world through symbolic recursion. These gods are not dream symbols. They are real beings who use dreams as interfaces. Their cults often exist in overlapping states, fragments in both waking and dream worlds, with adherents who blur the line between the two. This introduces a terrifying possibility that the mind itself can become a shrine, an altar, or a gate. Worship in this framework is not performed in space, but in thought. We must pause here and consider the strange paradox these cults embody. Their gods neither need nor notice their worshippers, and yet the worship persists. This is not a transactional faith. There is no covenant, no reward, no paradise. The cultist acts not in expectation of divine favor, but in imitation of cosmic order or disorder. Rituals may not be effective in the magical sense, but they are performative acts of alignment. The worshipper attempts to tune the self to the frequency of the god, often at the cost of identity. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the human collaborators do not serve the my-go for gain. They do so because they have come to believe human limitation is irrelevant. They accept transformation into brain canisters not as horror, but as liberation from biological constraint. It is not worship. They have been absorbed into a new ontology. This reveals something profound. The cultist's transformation is often a mirror of the entity's essence. Worshippers of Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, are portrayed as fecund, grotesque, and animalistic. Their rituals emphasize multiplication, merging, and sensory excess. Devotees of Yog-Sothoth, who is described as the gate, the key, and the guardian of the gate, often exhibit obsession with time, thresholds, and dimensional overlap. These are not random attributes. The cult does not simply worship the god. It becomes the god's thematic expression. This alignment between metaphysical concept and embodied ritual is a hallmark of these fictions. The entities are not metaphors, yet they behave metaphorically. They shape the culture of their cults in ways that rewrite physicality, identity, and perception itself. We must also ask what it means that these entities are so often asleep, hidden, or half-present. The sleeping god is a recurring motif, not because it is waiting to be awakened in a mythic sense, but because its partial presence destabilizes reality. In the Dunwich horror, the child of Yog-Sothoth is born invisible, its body intruding on our world without fully crossing over. In the Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu dreams in Arlia, and his dreams send waves through human minds. These dreams cause artists to go mad, seismographs to stutter, and rituals to intensify. The god is not here, but the effects of its attention are already felt. This establishes a model of asymmetrical presence. The god does not arrive. We intersect its emanations. The cult is therefore not preparing for a future event, but enduring a current contamination. Finally, there is the question of the cultist's role in this structure. If the entity is beyond care, beyond moral alignment, and beyond time, what does the human act of worship signify? The unsettling answer is that the cultists may not matter at all. Their rituals may be echoes of something forgotten, misalignments in evolutionary memory, or accidental rediscoveries of ancient frequencies. And yet, they persist. This is not irrational. It is ritual as recursion. The cultist reenacts a gesture older than language, older than life, and in doing so, possibly reactivates connections that should remain dormant. The horror here is not of evil, but a participation in a system too large to understand. The cultist becomes a node in an unfathomable network, part of a cosmology where roles are assigned without explanation and where outcomes do not resemble anything we might recognize as purpose. The line between knowledge and sanity is one of the central tensions in cosmic horror, and it is most acutely embodied in those individuals who come too close to the truth. The cultists, scholars, and accidental witnesses who confront the inhuman and return altered, if they return at all. Unlike traditional portrayals of madness as moral, failing, or divine punishment, in this framework, madness is often the natural consequence of exposure to ontological trauma. The forgotten cults, in this context, are not the cause of madness. They are its sanctuary. Their members do not fear epistemic collapse. They welcome it. They understand that madness is not a barrier to knowledge, but its price. To join the cult is not to become unhinged, but to become aligned with a different axis of reality. This reframing of insanity is made explicit in many foundational texts. In the Call of Cthulhu, Inspector Legras discovers a swamp cult whose members speak of great Cthulhu rising when the stars are right, and many of them exhibit symptoms that would, in any other context, be labeled as delusional. But their madness is coherent within its own structure. They share dreams, phrases, and beliefs across generations and geographies. It is not chaos. It is a parallel logic. Lovecraft himself often portrays madness as a symptom of forbidden insight rather than mental disorder. In Dagon, the narrator concludes, "I'm writing this under an appreciable mental strain, for I fear I shall soon be gone." He's not incoherent. He is articulating what he should not have seen. The horror lies not in his confusion, but in his clarity. We must recognize that this shift repositions madness as a kind of epistemological realignment. In many of these stories, cultists are portrayed as calm, even serene, despite their apparent instability. They have moved beyond ordinary perception, abandoning the consensus reality in favor of an inner consistency defined by dreams, symbols, and cosmic proximity. The chants they repeat are not signs of breakdown, but rituals of coherence, efforts to remain synchronized with whatever presence they serve. In this sense, madness becomes an adaptive state, not a malfunction. It is society that misreads it, just as it misreads the cults themselves as criminal, hysterical, or perverse. But beneath the surface lies a terrifying question. What if the cultists are not sick, but correct? Consider carefully the symbolic significance of collective madness. In numerous stories, we encounter entire groups of people, villages, families, even cities, whose behavior deviates from accepted norms in eerily coordinated ways. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the townspeople are described as having peculiar gaits, strange facial features, and antisocial habits. The protagonist initially reads these as signs of degeneracy or disease, only to discover that the town has aligned itself with a deep-sea entity through interbreeding and ritual. The madness is not individual, it is infrastructural. The cult in this case functions as a psychic ecosystem, a community that has metabolized alien contact. Its language, architecture, and rituals have evolved to support a new reality. Madness, here, is not a deviation from the norm. It is the new norm, maintained in secret. The consequences of interaction with cosmic beings vary, but they often follow a recognizable pattern: exposure, destabilization, transformation, or disappearance. The cultist either collapses inward, consumed by paradox, or is altered so thoroughly that they are no longer recognizable as human. This transformation is sometimes physical, but more often it is cognitive. They begin to see patterns where others see randomness. They perceive voices in silence, intentions in natural disasters, meanings in dreams. This shift is portrayed not as hallucination, but as a shift in perceptual capacity. In The Haunter of the Dark, the protagonist warns that the shining trapezohedron shows things no man was meant to see, suggesting that the artifact does not create illusions, it reveals too much. The resulting madness is not distortion, but hyperclarity, a form of perception for which the brain is unequipped. We must also examine the social function of madness within the narrative. Cults are often dismissed or suppressed by institutions, not because they are false, but because their truths are unusable. They offer no utility, no comfort, no redemption. Their knowledge cannot be integrated into religious doctrine, scientific theory, or national mythology. Therefore, it must be pathologized. Governments, churches, and universities often appear in these stories as agents of erasure, burning manuscripts, closing archives, institutionalizing witnesses. Madness, then, becomes a kind of camouflage, a way for dangerous knowledge to be hidden in plain sight. The cultist survives, not by resisting madness, but by weaponizing it, using it as a veil to continue their work unnoticed. This reveals something profound. In cosmic horror, madness is not the failure of the mind, but the reshaping of it by non-human logic. The cultist does not fall from reason. They ascend into a new kind of order, one that appears insane only to those still trapped in a linear, anthropocentric worldview. Their beliefs may be self-annihilating, but they are not incoherent. They are dangerous precisely because they make sense within the framework of a universe ruled by entropy, indifference, and recursion. Madness, in this light, is not tragic. It is ritualized. It is chosen. And for those who glimpse the abyss and keep staring, it is necessary. In the world of cosmic horror, knowledge is not a path to enlightenment. It is a catalyst for disintegration. The cults that pursue hidden truths do so not out of arrogance or hubris, but because something old, buried, or half-remembered pulls them toward it. The result is not revelation in the theological sense, nor transformation in the redemptive one. It is collapse, epistemic collapse. The moment when the frameworks that structure thought, language, causality, morality, selfhood cease to function. These are not stories of people driven mad by secrets. They are accounts of what happens when the very concept of knowing breaks down. The forbidden knowledge at the center of these cults is not forbidden because of content, but because of effect. It cannot be known without consequence. We must begin with the texts, the infamous Necronomicon, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Courtes de Gaulle. These are not books in any ordinary sense. They do not merely contain information, they transmit instability. To read them is not to receive facts, but to initiate transformation. Lovecraft describes the Necronomicon as a volume that drives men mad, yet he rarely specifies why. There are no detailed expositions of its chapters, no theological summaries. This is intentional. The book functions not as a grimoire, but as a narrative virus. Its power lies in implication. Consider this carefully. Its influence operates through citation, through rumor, through proximity. Characters who do not read it in full still suffer its effects. It is not the knowledge itself. It is the act of reaching for it that begins the unraveling. These texts often exhibit strange temporal behaviors. Passages appear different on each reading. Symbols rearrange. Marginalia disappears. Sometimes the act of translating or studying them initiates dreams, seizures, or fugue states. This instability is not portrayed as supernatural. It is structural. The books are expressions of logic, alien to the human mind. They may not have authors in the usual sense, and their content may be transdimensional or recursive. One does not study them in the academic sense. One is studied by them. The knowledge they contain is not additive, it is subtractive, removing layers of assumption, confidence, and conceptual boundaries until what remains is no longer recognizable as a coherent worldview. In this framework, epistemic collapse becomes the defining experience of the cultist or scholar. It is not a sudden shattering, but a slow erosion of coherence. Symptoms include déjà vu, time distortion, obsessive ideation, and a feeling that reality has become semi-transparent. In the dreams in the witch house, the protagonist begins seeing non-Euclidean angles in his architecture, hearing rhythms that do not belong to this world. His descent is not dramatic. It is gradual, textured, and irreversible. The cults who traffic in this knowledge do not view this as madness. They see it as initiation. The collapse is not a problem to be cured. It is the gateway to alignment with the cosmic. The old self must fragment before the new awareness can emerge. We must pause here to distinguish between knowing about and being known by. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror often reverses this relationship. The text, the entity, or the symbol is not merely observed, it observes. In the nameless city, simply descending into the ruins opens the narrator to something watching from within the stone, within the memory of the place. The cultist, once exposed to this presence, is no longer a seeker. They are a participant. The knowledge itself has agency. It spreads, not as content, but as influence. This mechanism anticipates modern notions of mimetic infection, ideas that propagate not by reason, but by structural compulsion. The cult does not need to convert others. The knowledge wants to be known. This reveals something profound. The forbidden is not dangerous because it is hidden. It is dangerous because it changes what it means to know. In most philosophical traditions, knowledge increases agency. In cosmic horror, knowledge erodes it. One begins to see connections where none should exist. One hears names in static, feels meaning in coincidence. senses a system too large to map, but too close to ignore. The horror is not in what is learned, but in the inability to unlearn it. Knowledge, in this sense, is not power, it is gravity. Once the mind is drawn in, escape is impossible. The cultist understands this. They surrender not because they are broken, but because the alternative, resisting, is incoherent within the new logic. The most disquieting implication of all is this. Perhaps the cults never intended to use the knowledge. Perhaps their goal was always its dissemination. If the knowledge is a virus, then the cult is its vector. Their rituals, chants, and symbols do not seek to awaken the gods. They seek to awaken the conditions under which the gods can re-enter perception. The cult's role is not one of mastery, but of service to the knowledge itself. They preserve it, spread it, and vanish, not because they failed, but because the infection took hold elsewhere. The cultist does not need to understand the knowledge. They need only to carry it. The reader, too, is implicated. In encountering these fragments, these names, these echoes, they too become vectors. They too are now part of the pattern. The earliest literary appearances of forgotten cults in cosmic horror fiction do not arrive fully formed, but emerge gradually as narrative shadows, peripheral references, ritual remnants, or unsettling communities hinted at through unreliable narrators. They do not dominate the plot. They haunt its edges. This vagueness is not a narrative flaw, but a deliberate technique. These cults gain their power from omission. The less we know about their structure, origin, and intention, the more they seem to resonate across time and story. In this sense, their influence is not isolated to individual works, but exists through a web of intertextual references, evolving through reuse, contradiction, and deliberate incompletion. H.P. Lovecraft's 1926 story, The Call of Cthulhu, provides the earliest and most influential appearance of a cult devoted to an elder god. Here, the worship of Cthulhu is not an ancient mythology preserved in temples, but a scattered underground practice that spans continents and epochs. The narrative centers on a series of documents discovered by Francis Wayland Thurston, a professor who investigates the mysterious death of his uncle. Through overlapping fragments, a police report from Louisiana, a sailor's account of a Pacific encounter, and scattered folklore, Thurston reconstructs a portrait of a vast but hidden cult. The members are described as half-castes, degenerate, or atavistic, using the racialized language of Lovecraft's era, yet their appearance only superficially masks the deeper horror. They are carriers of a belief system that outlived empires and languages. The story's power lies in how it never shows the full cult. It suggests a network older than civilization, still active, and never fully understood. One of the most iconic lines from this story encapsulates the cult's metaphysical orientation. In his house, Adderalai, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. This single phrase does not describe dogma or theology. It establishes an atmosphere of suspension. The god is not dead, not alive, but dreaming, and the cult's purpose is not to resurrect him, but to align with his eventual return. This notion that time, death, and even worship are altered by cosmic scale reappears in countless later stories. The chant, Funglui Mowunaf Cthulhu Rulia Rugahnagel Vtagen, functions like a linguistic virus. It is not translated, it is pronounced. It appears in later works as graffiti, in dreams, or on artifacts, reinforcing the idea that the cult's presence is cumulative. It exists not just in one story, but across stories, as if the fiction itself is being infected. Intertextual continuity continues with The Dunwich Horror, 1928, where the isolated Whately family serves as a proxy cult to Yog-Sothoth. Here, the rituals are more explicitly described. Chants and strange languages, forbidden books, and livestock disappearances that signal occult activity. The story blends rural superstition with cosmic terror, positioning the cult not in exotic locales, but in the American countryside. This shift is significant. The horror is not foreign, it is local, hidden in plain sight. The Necronomicon is consulted by academics. The cult's effects are measured by scientists, and yet no one fully comprehends what is unfolding. Wilbur Whately's attempt to summon his father, Yog-Sothoth, results not in apotheosis, but annihilation. The cult's goal, once again, exceeds human understanding. What connects these early portrayals is not shared theology, but a shared strategy of narrative fragmentation. These cults are never fully explained. Their goals are implied, their rituals half understood, and their members depicted as disturbingly serene in the face of cosmic disaster. This stylistic decision serves several functions. First, it avoids over-explanation, allowing the reader to fill in the gaps with imagination, which in horror is often more effective than exposition. Second, it mimics real-world ethnographic encounter. When ancient religious practices are viewed through partial records, outsider reports, or hostile accounts. Third, it allows for cumulative world-building. A cult mentioned in one story gains weight when referenced in another, even if the details contradict. The contradictions themselves become part of the mythos, suggesting misinterpretation, regional variation, or deeper obscurity. Later authors expanded upon these early cults, but often maintained the technique of partial disclosure. Clark Ashton Smith, a contemporary and correspondent of Lovecraft, contributed to the mythos with tales of lost civilizations and alien gods, but his cults often bordered on the decadent and sensual. In Smith's world, worship becomes a Baroque aesthetic, saturated with decay. In contrast, Robert E. Howard's contributions, such as the Serpent Men of the Shadow Kingdom, depict cults as evolutionary relics, non-human remnants seeking to reclaim dominance. These differing portrayals were not contradictions, but expansions. The mythos was never meant to be clean or canonical. It was meant to feel ancient, fragmented, and impersonal. Each new story did not clarify, but echoed the ones before. One of the most fascinating aspects of these early portrayals is how they laid the foundation for meta-fictional recursion. The cult becomes more than an object of narrative. It becomes a mechanism within it. The stories themselves act as rituals, summoning fragments of the myth. The reader, by encountering these tales, becomes part of the epistemological infection. This is not incidental. It reflects the cult's narrative function. They do not offer resolution or closure, but rupture. The cult arrives not as plot device, but as ontological event. It alters the structure of the story itself, introducing gaps, contradictions, and impossible implications. The reader, like the scholar in The Call of Cthulhu, assembles fragments and ends with more questions than answers. Of all Lovecraft's works exploring hidden sects and their incomprehensible allegiances, The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, remains the most detailed and disturbing portrayal of a cult embedded within the everyday world. Unlike the fragmentary references and mythic obscurities of The Call of Cthulhu, this story immerses the reader in a geographic, social, an architectural embodiment of cosmic worship. The cult in question, the esoteric order of Dagon, does not operate in secrecy alone, but as the dominant religious, economic, and political force in a decaying New England town. It represents a crucial narrative evolution from the marginal cult as scattered whisper to the embedded cult as decaying community, and in doing so, it provides one of the clearest fictional explorations of how a human society might willingly surrender itself to the alien. The narrative follows an unnamed protagonist who visits the town of Innsmouth as part of a genealogical and architectural tour. What begins as a travelogue slowly shifts into ethnography, then paranoia, and finally a revelation of cosmic kinship. Through fragmented conversations, furtive locales, and hidden documents, the protagonist learns that the town's elite made a pact generations ago with undersea beings known as the Deep Ones. In exchange for gold and fish, resources Innsmouth could not otherwise secure, the townspeople offered worship and eventually interbreeding. Over time, the population physically changed. The young appear human, but age into their aquatic ancestry. The cult is thus not only philosophical, but biological. It transforms not just minds, but bodies. The esoteric order of Dagon is portrayed not as an aberration, but as a resilient institution. Its churches, its symbols, notably the hybrid star-shaped insignia, and its hierarchies suggest a structured theology with internal coherence. Yet it defies classification. It is not Christianity, nor paganism, nor simple animism. It is transactional, pragmatic, and yet deeply mystical. The cult members do not worship the Deep Ones out of fear alone, but because they believe in the inevitability and desirability of transformation. As the protagonist learns from the drunken Zadok Allen, they'd been talking about some kind of life that'd be everlasting, worshipping gods from the sea who'd bring them immortality. This immortality, however, comes at a cost: the loss of individuality, the surrender of human form, and the replacement of terrestrial ancestry with something pre-human. We must pause here to consider what the story reveals about the psychology of cult participation. The people of Innsmouth are not under mass delusion. Rather, they have made a deliberate choice to align themselves with an alien force. For many, this begins as a survival strategy during economic collapse, suggesting a parallel with real-world patterns of cult recruitment during times of social upheaval. But over generations, the alignment becomes complete. The original horror, contact with the Deep Ones, evolves into acceptance. The residents no longer see the outsider's revulsion as meaningful. It is not madness. It is consensus. The horror here is not in the presence of the cult, but in its success. It has supplanted previous belief systems, infiltrated local government, and rewritten the identity of the town. Narratively, the story executes a slow epistemic descent. The protagonist gathers evidence piece by piece: a government warning, strange genealogical gaps, fishy smells, barred windows. But the final twist occurs not in the town, but in the protagonist's own bloodline. He learns that he, too, is descended from the Innsmouth lineage. The horror is not that he discovered the cult, it is that he is already part of it. And more disturbingly, the story ends not with flight, but with acceptance. He dreams of the cities beneath the sea. He looks forward to reuniting with his mother and uncle. I shall dwell with them in glory forever. This reveals something profound. The horror has become desire. The cult does not merely conquer space, It conquers the self. This conclusion functions as a metaphorical reversal. The outsider becomes the insider. The investigator becomes the initiate. What began as a tale of discovery ends as one of transformation and surrender. The reader is left without closure, only a lingering sense of inevitability. This shift in narrative perspective destabilizes the genre. If the protagonist's fate is union with the inhuman, then the reader must ask, was the cult truly malevolent, or simply a more accurate expression of the universe's indifferent design? It is not a battle of good versus evil. It is a shift in alignment, from human-centered meaning to cosmic recursion, not destruction, but assimilation. The shadow over Innsmouth thus occupies a pivotal place in the literary development of cosmic horror cults. It takes the fragments and implications of earlier stories and grounds them in a physical, social, and genealogical setting. It explores not only what the cult believes, but how it survives, how it spreads, and how it rewrites perception from within. If the shadow over Innsmouth represents the cult as a physical and societal structure embedded within geographic space, the dream quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926-1927, published posthumously in 1943, explores an entirely different mode of cosmic allegiance, the cult as psychic architecture. In this novella-length work, Lovecraft constructs an elaborate cosmology in which dreams are not symbols of unconscious desire, but locations, gateways, and meeting grounds for trans-dimensional forces. The beings encountered are not always malevolent. Some are distant, others playful, but none are anthropocentric. And among these, one finds cults that operate not in cities or ruins, but within states of mind, dream topographies, and altered cognition. The narrative itself becomes a form of initiation, guiding both protagonist and reader through layered epistemic landscapes where meaning is never stable. The protagonist, Randolph Carter, seeks the majestic city of his dreams, a luminous, half-remembered realm he believes must be real. As he journeys through the dreamlands, he encounters strange races, godlike beings, and fragments of forbidden worship. Notably, he repeatedly brushes against the presence of Nyarlathotep, the so-called crawling chaos, a being who acts as both messenger and manipulator for incomprehensible cosmic forces. Unlike the slumbering Cthulhu or the mindless Azathoth, Nyarlathotep is active, articulate, and able to traverse both waking and dreaming worlds. The cults associated with him are not unified, but scattered, expressed through chants heard in temples, gestures made by inhuman priests, and cities shaped by impossible geometries. Worship here is not devotional, it is spatial and aesthetic. The cult manifests through architecture, dream pattern, and ritual behavior, not ideology. Carter's encounters with these dream cults are not always direct. In some cities, such as the Forbidden Plateau of Leng or the moon-dwelling cities of the insectoid moon beasts, he hears only rumors or sees signs of vanished rituals. The cults appear to be residual, yet persistently influential. In this, Lovecraft uses a classic ethnographic trick, layering hearsay, ruins, and half-translated inscriptions to imply a history that remains just out of reach. As with previous cult portrayals, what is not explained becomes more powerful. One such moment occurs when Carter finds himself in the city of the Great Ones, godlike figures revered by mortals but manipulated by Nyarlathotep. The priests who guard them, beings called rubbery, faceless, and robed in purple, may not be cultists in the human sense, but they perform the ritual behaviors of cosmic alignment. guarding gateways, enforcing dream laws, and punishing transgression. What makes these dream cults distinct is the blurring of dream and belief. In Innsmouth, belief leads to transformation. In Kadath, dreaming becomes an act of devotion. Carter's journey is not merely about exploration. It is a metaphysical practice, and his insistence on finding the city he longs for becomes a kind of pilgrimage. The narrative suggests that persistent dreaming itself becomes worship, even if unintentional. This introduces a profound metaphysical tension. Is dreaming of a god equivalent to summoning it? Carter's journey awakens the attention of Nyarlathotep precisely because he has dared to seek. The final revelation that the city of his dreams is simply a reflection of his childhood memories comes not as comfort, but as destabilization. The journey was real, the cultic consequences remain, and the dreamlands are now permanently altered by his quest. The philosophical implication is clear. Intention does not matter. Exposure itself is participation. Carter never sets out to worship Nyarlathotep or interact with the Great Ones, yet his dream quest provokes them. He becomes a cultist without creed, simply by aligning his inner life with forbidden zones of thought. This is a powerful narrative device. It suggests that cultic alignment can occur without conscious volition, that deep yearning, curiosity, or obsession are sufficient. In cosmic horror, the unconscious becomes complicit. The line between dreaming and summoning, between imagining and invoking, is not just thin, it may be non-existent. The cult, in this formulation, is not external to the dreamer. It is coextensive with the dreaming itself. Another element of note is how the dream quest of unknown Kadath reframes madness as exploration rather than collapse. Carter does not lose his mind. He extends it. He travels further into unreality than most protagonists survive, and he returns, marked, yes, but coherent. This narrative deviation suggests that some minds may not fracture upon exposure, but instead expand to accommodate the contradiction. This idea will reappear in later works by other writers who depict long-term cultists not as raving lunatics, but as disturbingly composed. Their sanity is not absence, it is reconfiguration. They have learned to operate within the logic of the dream, and therefore survive. We must recognize then that the dream quest of unknown Kadath shifts the narrative function of the cult. It is no longer an external organization acting upon the world. It is a distributed pattern, encoded in symbols, places, dreams, and forgotten rites. It does not ask for worship. It responds to curiosity. The reader, by following Carter's journey, participates in the same descent. The story itself becomes a form of ritual, an extended chant, an invocation disguised as fantasy. And like all effective cultic mechanisms, it does not close with certainty, but with suggestion. The gods are still watching. The dream continues. The boundaries are thinner now. As the mythos of forgotten cults expanded beyond H.P. Lovecraft's original circle of stories, later writers began to inherit, adapt, and reinterpret the idea of secret, vanishing sects aligned with cosmic forces. Chief among these was August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor, and perhaps the most influential, though controversial figure in shaping what became known as the Cthulhu mythos. Derleth's approach introduced structure where Lovecraft had avoided it, morality where Lovecraft had implied only indifference, and an explicit metaphysical conflict that transformed the cultic horror from one of existential collapse into one of cosmic dualism. The effect of these revisions was profound. While they expanded the narrative scope and accessibility of the mythos, they also diluted its core philosophical unease. The cults became more organized, their gods more allegorical, and their rituals increasingly formulaic. And yet, even in this reconfiguration, the seed of unknowable dread persisted, splintered perhaps, but never eradicated. Derleth's most notable intervention was his categorization of the mythos into elemental forces, beings of air, earth, fire, and water, each aligned either with good elder gods or evil great old ones. In this model, cults became factions in a supernatural war, some trying to awaken destructive entities like Cthulhu, others preserving protective knowledge through secret orders. This Manichaean structure introduced the idea of cosmic balance, where previously there had been only entropy and indifference. Derleth's cults no longer worshipped beings that destabilized reality, but entities that threatened it in familiar, apocalyptic terms. Their rituals began to resemble occult warfare. Protective circles, incantations, prophecies, and forbidden tomes treated as strategic tools. The narrative tension shifted from existential dread to cosmic conflict. For many purists, this marked a betrayal of Lovecraft's original vision. We must pause here to ask, what was lost in this transformation? Under Lovecraft, the cult existed as a vector for epistemological destabilization. It represented not just hidden worship, but the presence of a logic incompatible with human thought. Derleth's reinterpretation, while more narratively coherent, recontained the horror. It made the cult legible, motivated by belief, aligned to purpose, susceptible to defeat. The ambiguity that once rendered the cults so disturbing, their fragmentary knowledge, contradictory behaviors, and metaphysical vagueness, was replaced with clarity. They became agents of evil rather than conduits of the unknowable. As a result, the fear they inspired became familiar. No longer rooted in ontological collapse, it was now couched in eschatological terms, a cosmic battle that, like all stories of good and evil, presumed a structure that could be understood. Yet despite these shifts, later writers in the Lovecraftian tradition found ways to restore ambiguity, often by reintroducing regional, cultural, or philosophical complexities. Ramsey Campbell's work, for example, relocated the mythos to the English countryside, where cults became entangled with ancient British folklore. In stories like The Inhabitant of the Lake, the beings worshipped are not clearly identified as good or evil. They are simply there, lurking beneath the landscape, indifferent and ancient. Campbell's cults are more localized, shaped by geography and tradition, but they retain the same disruptive aura as Lovecraft's originals. They are difficult to categorize, their rituals only partially revealed, and their goals ultimately inscrutable. Campbell reintroduced the sense that cults do not serve gods. They maintain dangerous connections. Thomas Ligotti offers a more philosophical extension of the cultic concept. While his stories rarely depict formal sex, they often portray individuals or small groups who stumble upon or cultivate belief systems so nihilistic that they function as cults of thought. In The Last Feast of Harlequin, for instance, a secretive society holds an annual ritual in honor of an ancient, clown-like entity connected to darkness, identity dissolution, and subterranean transformation. The protagonist's discovery of this tradition leads not to revelation, but to existential disintegration. Ligotti's cults are not organizational, they are ontological disturbances. He strips away the theatricality of robes and tomes and instead presents cultism as a state of philosophical infection. In this way, he returns the mythos to its original concern, the disintegration of meaning in the face of cosmic truth. Modern pastiches and reinterpretations have also pushed the concept of the cult into digital, liminal, and transmedia spaces. Some writers depict online communities that inadvertently summon entities through memes, collaborative fiction, or algorithmic rituals. Others create fictional academic papers, podcasts, or recovered documents that describe rituals with unsettling specificity. In these works, the cult is no longer bound by place or lineage. It is distributed, viral, and participatory. The cult may not even know it is a cult. A forum of dream sharers, a Discord server discussing the recursive sea, a subreddit sharing images of impossible architecture. These become new cultic forms. The ritual is not blood or chant, but attention, repetition, pattern recognition. The gods are not awakened by worship, but by information density. This shift reflects our contemporary anxieties about the loss of epistemic boundaries, the proliferation of conspiracies, and the porousness of digital identity. The modern cult is not a gathering of robed figures in a cellar. It is a networked awareness and emergent behavior. And yet, it retains the essential feature of its predecessors. It destabilizes. It makes the world less explainable. It produces not belief, but doubt. Not revelation, but recursion. This reveals something profound. No matter how much the mythos has evolved, the function of the cult remains consistent. Whether localized or digital, grotesque or subtle, organized or formless, the cult points towards something beyond cognition. It is never the endpoint. It is the doorway. The idea of forgotten cults that once sought to awaken incomprehensible entities and then vanished has long since escaped the boundaries of fiction. While the stories of Lovecraft and his successors established the literary framework, their influence has bled into urban legend, conspiracy theory, paranormal folklore, and internet hoaxes. These manifestations operate not as homage, but as extensions, modern echoes of a much older impulse to believe in hidden knowledge, secret groups, and cosmic forces that operate outside of human understanding. The myth of the vanished cult persists because it answers a deeply unsettling question. What if some knowledge is not lost, but concealed? And what if its concealment was necessary? In the shadow of this question, the cult becomes more than a narrative. It becomes a psychic placeholder for everything we fear might be real but cannot prove. Throughout the 20th century, scattered reports and regional folklore emerged that mirror the tropes of fictional cosmic cults. From tales of entire towns abandoned overnight to rumors of isolated religious communities practicing inhuman rites, the myth of the vanishing sect took root in the cultural imagination. In the Pacific Northwest, some local legends speak of caves that house non-human chanting during certain lunar phases. In the Appalachian regions, whispers persist of the drowned ones, a people said to have left no graves, only carvings in stone, spirals, eyes, and impossible maps. These stories often surface in oral form, disconnected from any clear origin. They circulate because they are fertile narrative structures, open-ended, mutable, and consistent with the themes of modern uncertainty. They do not require proof. They require resonance. We must recognize that hoaxes, too, play a vital role in the cultic afterlife. Consider the infamous Zanfretta incident in 1970s Italy, where a night watchman claimed to have encountered beings of immense size and alien origin. In subsequent sessions under hypnosis, he described underground chambers, lights in the sea, and a race of non-terrestrial worshippers. While this has largely been categorized as an alien abduction narrative, its structural resemblance to cosmic horror is striking. Hidden spaces, lost time, non-Euclidean interiors, and cryptic messages. Similarly, internet-based hoaxes such as the Cicada 33E1 puzzles or the Mayday mystery employ a cultic aesthetic, obscure references, cryptographic challenges, and the sense of an unseen guiding intelligence. Whether real, fabricated, or collaborative fiction, they engage with the same core structure, the idea that there is a deeper order just beyond our grasp, and that someone, somewhere, already knows it. The persistence of real cult sightings, whether in abandoned temples, unsettling video footage, or manipulated photographs, reveals a collective fascination with absence. In many ways, it is not the presence of the cult that frightens us. It is their disappearance. We are more disturbed by an empty house that shows signs of sudden departure than by one currently occupied. The cult that once was, and is no longer, invokes a different kind of fear. It suggests completion, not interruption, but fulfillment. The old tools left behind, bone flutes, blood-stained manuscripts, stone idols, become relics not of failure, but of success. This reverses the logic of religious suppression. These cults were not stopped, they finished, and we are left in the aftermath, waiting for the consequences. In digital folklore, these themes have mutated into viral narratives. Reddit threads on R No Sleep, YouTube videos on abandoned towns, and ARGs, alternate reality games, often blur fact and fiction to produce moments of epistemic destabilization. One notable example is the Local 58 YouTube series, which presents eerie television broadcasts suggesting contact with alien or eldritch forces. While never explicitly invoking cults, it implies an invisible influence, a background belief system shaping media, government, and time itself. The viewer becomes the witness. The screen becomes the altar. The ritual is repetition, watching, sharing, decoding. In these spaces, the cult no longer needs members. The audience becomes the congregation simply by engaging. This reveals something profound. The myth of the forgotten cult persists because it externalizes a universal human tension, the desire to know, paired with the fear of knowing too much. The cult embodies both. It is the vehicle of forbidden knowledge and its warning. When we speak of vanished cults, we are speaking of a psychological state. The knowledge we suspect is out there. The rituals we fear have worked. The gods we pretend not to dream of. In this sense, the cult is not merely a plot device. It is a cultural function, a symbol that gives shape to amorphous dread. We fear what we cannot name. The cult names it, and then disappears. And so, we are left with fragments. A journal page in a museum drawer. A sigil etched into a highway underpass. A child's drawing of a being with too many eyes. None of it proves anything, but together they construct a web of implied belief, a mythos of suggestion. The forgotten cult is not gone. It is distributed. It lives in stories, rumors, images, and doubts. It thrives in the ambiguity between fiction and experience. And as long as that ambiguity endures, so too will the cult, half remembered, half invented, wholly feared. What they worshipped may be unknowable. Whether they succeeded, we do not know. But their disappearance, their conspicuous absence, remains the most unsettling trace of all. The myth of the forgotten cult has proven remarkably adaptable across modern media, transcending its literary origins to permeate film, video games, and music. These cults, once confined to footnotes in fictional academic treatises or whispered rumors in pulp magazines, have become central figures in visual and interactive storytelling. Their persistence in culture speaks to their symbolic flexibility. They represent systems of belief that resist scrutiny, promise transcendence through horror, and imply that worship can unravel the very structure of reality. In these adaptations, the cult is often used not simply as antagonist or setting, but as an aesthetic logic, a narrative and symbolic force that organizes experience around secrecy, transformation, and annihilation. Film has long served as a fertile medium for the visual reimagining of cultic horror. One of the most direct homages to Lovecraftian themes is John Carpenter's The Mouth of Madness, 1994, in which a best-selling horror author's writings begin to alter reality. The fictional cults who adore these texts are not confined to rituals. They are part of a mimetic infection. Their belief makes the horror real, and the protagonist's descent into madness mirrors the reader's engagement with forbidden knowledge. In The Wicker Man, 1973, although not cosmic in nature, the island cult's eerie normalcy and joyful sacrifice function similarly. The viewer realizes too late that the ritual has been working all along. More recently, films like Ari Aster's Hereditary, 2018, and Midsommar, 2019, resurrect the motif of an ancient, persistent cult whose practices are not ancient relics, but ongoing structures hidden in modernity's blind spots. Video games have embraced the forgotten cult, not just thematically, but mechanically. Games like Bloodborne, 2015, construct entire worlds around unknowable gods, ancient rites, and plague-like transformations, with in-game cults acting as both lore objects and environmental design. The School of Mensis, for example, attempts to make contact with the Great Ones through ritual experimentation, resulting in cognitive collapse and reality distortion. Here, the cult's failure becomes the setting itself. Yharnam is a broken world haunted by the aftermath of a successful contact. Similarly, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, and The Sinking City, 2019, directly adapt the themes of Lovecraftian cults into playable investigations, where encountering forgotten rites and half-submerged shrines is central to narrative progression. These games do not offer mastery. They simulate dread through discovery, echoing the original literary logic that knowledge leads not to victory, but to unraveling. Music, too, has absorbed the aesthetics and implications of these cults, especially in genres already predisposed to philosophical or mythic abstraction. The dark, ambient, and experimental metal scenes are particularly rich with references to forgotten worship and cosmic despair. Bands like Sun O, Portal, and Raison d'Etre construct sonic landscapes that evoke ritual, annihilation, and the presence of the inhuman. Lyrics are often indecipherable, instrumentation drone-like or chaotic, and album art filled with glyphs, decaying temples, and impossible structures. In these works, the music functions as ritual simulation, not mere homage, but an attempt to embody the experience of contact. Some artists go further, creating entire fictional religions or pseudo-mystical frameworks around their releases, blurring the line between performer and cultist, listener and initiate. What unites these media is their shared understanding that the cult is not just content, it is structure. It determines how the narrative unfolds, how the player navigates, how the viewer interprets. In Control, 2019, a video game by Remedy Entertainment, the Federal Bureau of Control investigates anomalous phenomena, many of which point toward rituals, chants, and secret worship, remnants of unknowable systems that still exert influence. Even when the cult is never directly shown, its residue permeates the world. An altered room, a phrase repeated across dimensions, an artifact that emits language no one can translate. In these cases, the cult is not defeated, it is distributed. The implication is not that the player has solved the mystery, but that they have activated something larger, simply by engaging. This reveals something profound. Modern media does not just replicate the cultic myth, it enacts it. The audience is no longer a distant reader. They are participant, investigator, witness. In found footage, horror like The Blair Witch Project, 1999, or Noroi, The Curse, 2005. The cult is never fully seen, but the viewer's gaze becomes part of the ritual. In ARGs, alternate reality games, players decode sigils, translate chants, and follow hidden URLs across platforms, engaging in behavior indistinguishable from fictional cultists. The act of play becomes an act of belief, even if performed ironically. The barrier between fiction and participation begins to erode. The cult survives not as a narrative device, but as a media phenomenon. We must ask, why does this structure persist so effectively across such varied forms? The answer lies in the cult's symbolic function. It dramatizes the fear that there is a system operating beneath the one we know, a set of rules, beliefs, and consequences we have forgotten or ignored. It provides an architecture for dread that feels organized, yet unknowable, seductive, yet destructive. In an era of algorithmic black boxes, fragmented realities, and conspiratorial thinking, the cult becomes a metaphor for the systems that structure our world without our consent. And because the cult always vanishes, it also stands in for the uncanny sense that whatever is truly in control has already moved on or gone deeper. The cults of cosmic horror, originally born from fiction, have not remained confined to literature, games, or film. Increasingly, the aesthetic, structural, and symbolic logic has been adopted within real-world subcultures and academic discourse alike. This process of appropriation is not necessarily literal. Few claim to worship Nyarlathotep or pray to Cthulhu in earnest. Instead, what persists is a philosophical posture, an aesthetic sensibility, an acknowledgement that traditional metaphysical structures may be insufficient to describe contemporary reality, and that horror offers a more honest language for navigating the unknown. In this context, the forgotten cult becomes a metaphor, a framework, and in some cases, a lifestyle. It is not worshipped, but inhabited. Within occult and esoteric circles, Lovecraftian mythos has frequently been reframed not as fiction, but as symbolic truth. Groups like the Esoteric Order of Dagon, yes, the name is intentionally borrowed, or the Typhonian Order in certain Thelemic branches, use elder gods not as actual deities, but as archetypes of transhuman forces, emblems of entropy, chaos, and cognitive expansion. Kenneth Grant, a disciple of Aleister Crowley, famously integrated Lovecraftian lore into his Nightside Kabbalistic system, arguing that the gods described by Lovecraft were genuine psychic realities accessible through magical practice. Whether interpreted as metaphors or portals, the elder gods became tools for Gnostic rupture, vehicles for destabilizing the self and invoking what lies beyond language. This convergence of fictional mythology and occult ritual reveals something profound, that the symbolic structure of cosmic cults is more durable than their fictional origin. Simultaneously, academic disciplines have taken increasing interest in the mythology of forgotten sects. Courses in literature, anthropology, and religious studies regularly engage with Lovecraftian cults not as supernatural realities, but as cultural artifacts. In this context, they are treated as reflective mirrors, mythical constructs that express 20th and 21st century anxieties around science, epistemology, race, and ecological collapse. Scholars such as S.T. Joshi, China Mieville, and Eugene Thacker have examined how cosmic horror interrogates the limits of human knowledge, especially in relation to post-structuralist philosophy and dark ecology. The cult, in these readings, becomes a site of conceptual inversion, a group that does not resist knowledge, but accelerates toward its disintegration. In Thacker's words, horror is not the depiction of death, but of life, lived under the shadow of its impossibility. The cult does not fear that shadow. It gathers beneath it. Subcultures have embraced the aesthetic of the forgotten cult in ways that blur sincerity and performance. In internet subcultures, from Tumblr to TikTok to obscure Discord servers, users adopt the language of the mythos in half-ironic, half-reverent tones. Profiles describe themselves as servants of the sleeper beneath, or eyes of Azathoth. Tags like Workum Eldritch Core or the Chwart Liminal Cult link photographs of decaying architecture, obscure sigils, and glitchy dream imagery to shared visions of non-human spirituality. These communities do not claim theological legitimacy, nor do they attempt literal reconstruction of fictional rites. Rather, they are engaged in what might be called aesthetic metaphysics, using horror as an emotional and symbolic language for alienation, sublimity, and disorientation in the digital age. The cult here is less a belief system and more a vibe, a ritualized experience of estrangement from reality. Even more intriguing are the semi-serious, semi-satirical religious movements that adopt Lovecraftian entities as central figures, not to parody belief, but to rethink its structure. The First United Church of Cthulhu and the Church of the Subgenius blend absurdism, occult satire, and genuine social commentary. In these groups, Cthulhu is not a literal god, but a stand-in for chaos, the absurdity of bureaucratic religion, or the inevitability of ecological doom. Their rituals are playful, but not meaningless. They reflect a kind of postmodern sacrilege, a recognition that old gods have died, but the need for myth remains. These organizations ask, implicitly, if belief is a structure more than a truth, can we build belief out of horror? Can dread be sacred? The cult becomes a performance not of faith, but of existential theater. Academia has also absorbed the logic of the cult into discussions of media theory and semiotics. The mythos is now analyzed as a mimetic network, names, sigils, and patterns that propagate not by belief, but by repetition. Media scholars frame the Necronomicon not as a magical book, but as an information hazard, a fictional device that reflects concerns about uncontrollable knowledge flows in the digital age. In this framework, cults become metaphors for cognitive infection, systems of thought that cannot be unlearned once encountered. This analytical move positions the cult not as a marginal anomaly, but as a core metaphor for how belief, knowledge, and trauma circulate in postmodern culture. We do not fear cults because they are irrational. We fear them because they are too rational within a framework we cannot accept. We must recognize that these appropriations, whether playful, academic, esoteric, or aesthetic, signal the endurance of the cult as a symbolic container. Its fictional form is powerful precisely because it was never closed. It was designed to be fragmentary, viral, and self-perpetuating. It did not offer salvation or morality. It offered the structure of belief without the reassurance of meaning. That is why it survives. In a world increasingly defined by system opacity, ideological fragmentation, and epistemic exhaustion, the myth of the forgotten cult provides a language for those who suspect that reality is not only stranger than we imagine, but stranger than we can imagine. To understand why the idea of forgotten cults continues to haunt the modern imagination, one must look beyond literature, folklore, and media. These cults endure not simply because they are frightening, but because they touch on something more fundamental, the fear that reality is not structured around us, but in spite of us. The persistent allure of these vanished sects lies in the unsettling proposition that the universe is not waiting to be understood, and that truth, once found, might not liberate, but unravel. They become metaphors not only for epistemic instability, but for existential displacement. The cult vanishes not just physically, it slips through the cognitive mesh of our meaning-making structures, leaving behind only symptoms, dreams, symbols, forgotten pages, and doubts. At the psychological level, the forgotten cult becomes a symbol of the desire for meaning in a meaningless cosmos. We want to believe that the world is governed by laws, that history is linear, that suffering has purpose. The cults of cosmic horror reject all of these premises. Their rituals are often inexplicable, their goals opaque, their gods utterly indifferent to morality. This inversion is terrifying, not because it proposes evil, but because it proposes irrelevance. The cultist does not seek power in the traditional sense. They seek to align themselves with something larger, even if it means annihilation. In this way, the cult becomes a dramatization of the philosophical confrontation with the void. It is not that they worship darkness, it is that they accept it where others avert their gaze. This reveals something profound. The most disturbing implication is not that the cult existed, but that it might have succeeded. Most horror fiction hinges on prevention. Something terrible almost happens. In cosmic horror, the opposite often lingers beneath the surface. The cult vanished because it accomplished what it intended. The world we now live in, the madness, the ecological collapse, the technological acceleration, the moral confusion, might be the after effect. The world is wrong, and the cult was right. This reversal of agency turns the reader, viewer, or thinker into a kind of retroactive witness. We are not facing the horror, we are inside its wake. Philosophically, this feeds into broader themes of posthumanism and anti-anthropocentrism. The cult's central belief that humanity is not the endpoint of evolution, nor the focus of divine attention, resonates uncomfortably with current scientific models of the universe. We are one species among billions, on one planet among trillions, in a cosmos where consciousness may not be unique, and where intelligence may be a glitch rather than a gift. The forgotten cult articulates this in ritual and myth. They do not elevate the human, they abandon it. They become transitional beings, choosing to dissolve boundaries rather than defend them. In this light, the cult is not deluded. It is honest, brutally, existentially honest. We must also consider the paradox of fascination and revulsion. Why are we drawn to the very ideas that unsettle us? Why do readers, gamers, academics, and artists continue to engage with the logic of these cults if their implications are corrosive? The answer may lie in what Nietzsche called the abyss that gazes back. To contemplate horror is to flirt with the forbidden, not only in moral terms, but in epistemic ones. The cult becomes a symbolic interface for engaging with the unspeakable. It allows us to simulate collapse without committing to it, to walk the edge of the precipice without jumping. Yet we must ask, how long before simulation becomes belief? How long before fascination becomes participation? The forgotten cult also functions as a symbolic container for unresolvable anxieties, climate catastrophe, technological acceleration, political fragmentation, existential loneliness. Each of these trends defies easy explanation or resolution. The cult offers a narrative form for these abstract fears. Its members have already accepted collapse, already made peace with instability. They are not resisting the tide. They are drowning on purpose. This is not nihilism in the common sense. It is not giving up. It is a kind of sacred surrender. The idea that meaninglessness, once accepted, can become liberating. For some, this is horrifying. For others, it is strangely comforting. The cult provides a mythic shape to what otherwise would be inchoate dread. And this perhaps is the final and most disquieting implication, that the cult, once forgotten, may begin to look like wisdom. In a time where institutional knowledge falters, where truth is fragmented, where systems of belief collapse under their own weight, the figure of the forgotten cult offers a model, not of truth, but of endurance. They knew something we do not. They saw something we still fear to name, and then they vanished. Their silence is louder than prophecy, their absence more haunting than any sermon. They do not offer hope, but they offer structure in the face of unknowing, a ritual when reason fails, a pattern when perception breaks. We end not with resolution, but with suggestion. The cults may be gone, their temples abandoned, their books burned, their chants forgotten, but their logic remains. Their symbols recur, and their silence deepens. They may have vanished from the world, but they have not vanished from the mind. And in the quiet hours, in the spaces between dream and waking, in the echo chambers of curiosity and dread, we may still hear them calling, not asking to be remembered, but to be rejoined.